Hi, welcome to Communication 200, Mass Communication and Society. My name is Jody Kerman. I'm a professor of English and Communications at Mendocino College. So our job this semester is to cover every form of mass communication, at least in a cursory way. We won't be able to get terribly in depth, but we will try to cover as much as we can. So those forms of mass communication will be covered one chapter at a time. The internet, popular music, sort of a historical as well as modern look at pop music. We'll be looking at radio, the history of radio, the invention of it, how it changed our culture, television and its impact on society, as well as where it's headed today, film and magazines, books in all their different forms, advertising, and also kind of the ethics of journalism and public relations. So there's a lot to cover, and I'm going to try to make it as fun as possible. Please don't hesitate to ask me questions if you have them. So we're going to start with Chapter 1, which is basically an overview. And my suggestion for your workflow would be to take a quick look at each chapter, get a sense of what it's about, and then watch these presentations that I put together so you can get an idea of what I think is most important. Then you can go back and read more carefully and take notes. We're using Media and Culture, 8th edition, which I think is a fantastic book, actually, and it has a lot of resources, lots of, historical overviews, so we get a clear sense of the history behind each form of mass media, as well as a look at modern culture and the media that's going on today, lots of graphs, pie charts, timelines, that kind of stuff, so that we can make sense of the dense statistics that they're throwing at us. So Chapter 1 begins with a look at news media and politics, the concern that as media outlets become more and more entertainment focused, we're getting less in-depth news. And the media storytellers are focusing our attention on trivial, entertainment-oriented news rather than important world issues. So there's concern that we're exploiting tragedy and not spending enough time on real events and not really having the critical distance that journalists in the past have prided themselves in. Let's look now at the eras of communication one at a time. The oral communication phase was basically, stories around a campfire when nothing was written down. There's some debate about the exact dates, but in general, the oral and written communication periods are thought to be between Western civilization's pre-modern period spanning to about 1,000 years before the Common Era. While today we take it for granted that educated people can read and write, there was actually a fair amount of debate about written culture during the time of the ancient Greeks. They were kind of suspicious of writing things down and worried that it would cheapen public discourse. China had basic paper and block printing about 100 years before the Common Era, but most historians agree that the invention of Gutenberg's printing press really revolutionized print culture and ushered in the modern era of printed works as a form of mass communication. The electronic era of communication began with the invention of the telegraph in the 1840s. This was the first time that information could be conveyed instantaneously across great distances. Lastly, we have the digital communication era, the one we're right in the heart of just now. Digital communication is defined as images, text, and sounds that are converted or encoded into electronic signals, usually represented as binary numbers, ones and zeros, etc., that are then reassembled or decoded as a precise reproduction of whatever it is. Let's say it's a TV image or a magazine article, a song, telephone voice, internet, etc. One of the things we're going to be looking at carefully this semester is the way the digital era has redefined journalism. bloggers and Facebook have really changed the way that we communicate, both personally and in terms of the way we distribute news. Let's look now at the two main definitions of media convergence. So the first is the merging of content across different media channels, right? So you've got a story and it's distributed onto various platforms. So you got something like Harry Potter, which was originally published as a novel, and then it became an audiobook. It also became an incredibly successful film franchise. And of course, you don't have to read it just in paper form. You can read it on any number of e-readers. So this is one example of media convergence. Definition number 2 is where one company, one corporation owns a huge number of media outlets. So you might have a TV station that then distributes their information through Kindle and through computers. Naturally, there is an element of corporate greed to this, but it's also a question of efficiency. If the same corporation can distribute one story across multiple platforms, it's seen as more efficient. In the old days, reporters were basically expected to go out and get the story for one form, a newspaper or radio. Now, reporters and journalists are expected to be multitaskers, gathering imagery, doing audio interviews, video, as well as writing the story for podcasts, perhaps presenting it on television, and generally maximizing the efficiency for the corporation. Anytime you have a new form of mass media, it goes through 3 basic stages of development. There's the novelty or development stage, where the thing is being invented, whether it's radio, internet, television. This is where the ideas are being tested out. And there's a wonderful film called Social Network, which probably most of you have seen, that covers the novelty stage of Facebook. This film does a great job dramatizing the invention of Facebook and some of the pitfalls and dramas that often go along with that process, where various people are taking credit for the invention and lawsuits often ensue. Then we have the entrepreneurial stage of development, where investors and inventors are trying to figure out the best way to use the invention. Some of this is about marketing and strategy, but in many cases, the first applications of an invention are the military. Both radio and the internet had their beginnings as military tools. Lastly, we have the mass medium stage, where businesses figure out how to market the invention. So radio, for example, had military origins, but it was really businesses that figured out how to distribute radio to millions of listeners. Now that we have a sense of how mass mediums evolve, let's look at 2 influential models in how they actually communicate messages. The linear model basically posits that the sender, let's say an author, for example, transmits a message, that's their text, through a mass media channel, a printed book, and then the receiver, which is the reader, receives it. One of the critiques of the linear model is that there's no place for feedback in it. The receiver just receives the message passively. The cultural model, by contrast, recognizes that audiences affirm, refashion, or reject messages that flow through various media channels. Our textbook uses the example of Lady Gaga's music video, Telephone, from 2010, in which critics called it extremely tasteless, making fun of transsexuals, exploiting women, whereas fans thought it was a cutting-edge exploration of alternative lifestyles. Although it is a little bit out of date, on page 15 you'll see a pie chart representing daily media consumption for 8 to 18-year-olds. Now let's look at contrasting metaphors for the way culture operates in our daily lives. Culture as a hierarchy represented by the skyscraper, and culture as a process represented by the map. The skyscraper model pits high culture against low culture, putting things like Hamlet and the ballet at the top and professional wrestling at the bottom. By contrast, when we look at culture as a map, this is less elitist, less hierarchical, more inclusive. So you'll see, for example, that we've got Shakespeare here as challenging, but also familiar. Most people know who Shakespeare is, but they don't necessarily turn to him for light reading. Let's look at the cultural values of the modern period versus the postmodern period. The modern period values efficiency, rationality, and moving forward, so rejecting tradition and embracing progress. The postmodern period begins in the 1950s and goes through to the present. It celebrates populism, basically power to the people, diversity, recycling. We question science now and also have a strong sense of irony and paradox. For example, modern versus postmodern architecture. Modern would be the Sears building. It's no nonsense, sleek, and industrial, whereas the Portland building is a pastiche of different styles. Modern versus postmodern film. We've got John Travolta in Grease. He's a man's man, very clear gender roles. Whereas in Hairspray, he plays a woman. This is more postmodern and ironic. Modern versus postmodern can even be represented in Soup. So we've got a 1950s ad with a nuclear family, mom in the kitchen, versus Andy Warhol's ironic art, where he recycles the image of the soup can and turns it into high art. And lastly, we have modern versus postmodern in men's fashion. James Bond in a tuxedo versus the tuxedo t-shirt. A man's man versus the ironic commentary. Critiquing media and culture requires a critical, but not necessarily a cynical approach. It involves really carefully analyzing the issue and looking at the facts. And it also encourages you to really be an active part of the cultural landscape. Whenever you examine any form of mass media, there are some steps you can take to ensure you'll be more thorough. The first phase is description, where you leave out any opinions and just give us the facts. So let's say you're looking at the film Pulp Fiction, for example. You're going to want to tell us who directed it. You're going to want to look at who's in it. You're going to want to cover where it's set. Things like that. The who, what, where, when, why. The next phase is analysis, where you want to break the movie down. So you want to look at symbolism, cinematography, narrative. Next is interpretation. So ask yourself, why this film? Why now? At the time that it came out, why was it so successful? What resonated about it with the viewers? Then there's evaluation. What is it worth? What's its value? And in this stage, we'll see a lot of your personal values. So if you think that it's, for example, full of gratuitous violence and therefore not a good movie, this is where you'll express that opinion. The last stage is engagement. So now you've looked at every aspect of the film. What are you going to do about it? Are you going to write a review for the internet? Are you going to create fan art? Are you going to tell everyone you know to see it or not see it? How are you going to engage? What are the benefits of analyzing mass media? Well, it allows us to evaluate the standards of our culture, to recognize the links between mass media and daily life, and it also helps us to monitor how well the democratic process is working. So that's the end of our review of Chapter 1. Tune in again next week when we cover the development and present-day realities of the Internet.